Sometimes the most important discoveries come from the biggest mistakes. Sometimes what breaks us open is exactly what we needed to find our true path. In the grand hall of Clan Nordhrafn, Ingrid holds a map that could save her starving people. Then Leif, a poor stable hand, trips and spills ale all over it. Everyone is furious until they see what the spilled liquid reveals: hidden markings that match her dead mother's stories about a legendary land. The accident that seemed like a disaster just became their salvation. But what ancient secret was hidden beneath that map? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Clan Nordhrafn stood like a monument to endurance against the harsh Norwegian coast. Thick wooden beams, darkened by decades of hearth smoke, stretched overhead like the ribs of some ancient whale. Shields lined the walls, some bearing fresh paint, others scarred by battles that had passed into legend. The air carried the mingled scents of pine resin, roasted meat, and the salt tang that never quite left anything near the sea. Ingrid, Eriksdottir, moved through this familiar space with the quiet confidence of someone who had grown up among warriors, but had learned that true strength often came from listening rather than shouting. At 26, she possessed her father's sharp intellect and her late mother's intuitive wisdom, though she would have been the last to claim either gift. Her auburn hair, braided with small silver rings that caught the firelight, fell past her shoulders like a cascade of autumn leaves. Her hands, calloused from years of working alongside the clan's craftsmen, held steady as she spread the precious map across the massive oak table that dominated the center of the hall. This map represented months of careful work. Ingrid had commissioned it after the failed harvest and the poor fishing season that had left their stores dangerously low. She had consulted with every seer within 3 days' travel, studied the patterns in old rune stones, and pieced together fragments of sailors' tales until a picture began to emerge, a route to new lands where her people might find the resources they desperately needed. The parchment itself was a work of art, made from the finest calfskin and treated with oils that would protect it from sea spray. It bore the careful markings of Brother Aldrich, a monk from the distant monastery who had once sailed with merchants before taking his vows. His steady hand had traced coastlines and marked currents, noting the positions of stars and the patterns of migrating birds. Every line represented knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death on the Whale Road. Around the great table, the clan's most trusted advisors gathered in the golden light of the evening feast. There was Magnus the shipwright, whose gnarled hands had shaped more vessels than any man living, his weathered face studying the proposed route with eyes that had seen every trick the sea could play. Beside him sat Astrid the wise woman, her grey hair adorned with bone pins, and her fingers tracing protective runes in the air as she examined the map's markings. Old Bjorn Ironbeard leaned forward on his walking stick, his remaining eye the other lost to a Saxon blade 20 years past, following the ink lines, with the intensity of a man who understood that maps were written in blood. As much as Ink Jarl Eric himself presided from his carved chair, its arms worn smooth by generations of leaders before him. His once golden beard had turned silver in the 5 years since his wife's death, but his presence still commanded the room. The weight of leadership had settled on his shoulders like a familiar cloak, heavy but necessary. He watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that this map represented not just a plan for survival, but her first true test as a leader who might someday guide their people. The conversation flowed around the table like a familiar tide. Magnus traced the proposed route with one thick finger, pausing at points where the currents might prove treacherous. "The waters here," he said, tapping a section marked with wavy lines, "they'll test even our best vessels. We'll need to reinforce the hulls and carry extra pine tar for repairs." Astrid nodded slowly, her attention focused on the mystical markings that bordered the map's edges. "The runes speak of favorable winds in the moon after next," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent reading signs in smoke and star patterns. But they also warn of deception, something hidden that must be revealed before the journey can succeed. Bjorn's weathered hand traced the coastline they would leave behind. "I've sailed these waters since before young Ingrid could walk," he said, his voice gravelly with age and countless winter nights spent telling tales by the fire. "Never seen such detailed markings of the currents beyond the Shetlands. Where did you find this knowledge, child?" Ingrid felt the familiar flutter of uncertainty in her chest, but her voice remained steady as she answered. "Some came from the Welsh trader who wintered with us 3 seasons ago. He spoke of lands where the fishing never failed and the soil yielded grain even in harsh years. The rest I pieced together from the old songs, the ones my mother used to sing about the lands beyond the sunset." At the mention of her mother, the table fell into a respectful silence. Sigrid Eriksdottir had been beloved not just as the Jarl's wife, but as a keeper of the old stories. A woman who could trace lineages back to the gods themselves, and who knew every tale of exploration and discovery that had been passed down through the generations. Her death from the wasting sickness had left a hole in the clan's memory as much as in their hearts. The firelight flickered across faces lined with experience and hardship. These were people who had survived raids, famines, and the endless uncertainty of life in a land where winter lasted half the year. They had learned to read signs in everything: the behavior of seabirds, the color of sunset clouds, the way ice formed on the fjord. Tonight, they were reading the signs in this map, trying to determine whether it pointed towards salvation or disaster. Leif stood in the shadows near the great doors, holding a wooden bucket filled with fresh ale. At 19, he was old enough to serve in the hall, but still young enough to feel invisible among the clan's important members. His clothes marked him clearly as one of the working folk. Rough woven wool dyed brown with walnut hulls, patches carefully sewn where wear had made holes, boots that had been resoled more than once. His hands, permanently stained with hay and horse sweat, gripped the bucket's rope handle as he waited for the signal to refill the horn cups that sat before each advisor. He had grown up in the shadow of greatness. His father had died in a raid when Leif was barely walking, leaving his mother to raise him on the charity of the clan. She had found work in the kitchens, and Leif had learned early that his place was to serve, not to dream. He tended the horses, hauled water, carried messages, and tried to stay out of the way of people who had more important things to do than notice a stable hand's presence. But tonight was different. Tonight, he couldn't stop watching Ingrid as she spoke about the map, her voice carrying a certainty that made him believe, for just a moment, that perhaps there really were lands beyond the sunset where a man could build something of his own. He had heard the stories, too, whispered by his mother as she kneaded bread in the pre-dawn darkness, tales his grandmother had told her about Sigrid's private conversations, moments when the Jarl's wife had spoken of visions that came to her in dreams. The discussion around the table had grown more animated. Magnus was expressing concerns about the number of ships they could spare for such a venture, while Astrid spoke of the spiritual preparations that would be necessary for a journey into unknown waters. Bjorn recounted tales of expeditions that had failed because leaders had ignored the wisdom of experience. It was then that Jarl Erik raised his hand for silence. The hall fell quiet, except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore. "My daughter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years and the love of a father who had watched his only child grow into a woman of strength and wisdom. "This map represents hope for our people. But hope without preparation is merely a dream. Tell us, what do you see when you look at these markings? What do the signs tell you about the journey ahead?" Ingrid leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the map's edges. The firelight caught the silver in her hair rings and illuminated the careful ink lines that represented so many hours of work and research. For a moment she was quiet, gathering her thoughts like a sailor reading the wind. "I see a chance," she said finally. "Not a certainty, but a chance. Our stores will last through this winter, but barely. If the next harvest fails, as this one did, if the fish continue to avoid our nets, then we face choices no clan should have to make. This map offers us an alternative, a route to lands that might welcome our skills and offer us the resources we need to survive and grow strong again. She traced one of the ink lines with her finger, following it to where it disappeared off the edge of the known world. But it's more than that. My mother used to say that sometimes the gods place opportunities in our path not because the journey will be easy, but because we're ready to become who we need to be. Perhaps this isn't just about finding new lands. Perhaps it's about discovering what we're truly capable of when we stop limiting ourselves to what we've always known. The words hung in the air like incense, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Around the table, weathered faces reflected the firelight and the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, there was still time to change their fate. It was at that moment, as the hall held its collective breath and the future seemed to balance on the edge of a decision, that Leif stepped forward to refill the empty alehorns. His mother had taught him to move quietly, to serve without interrupting the flow of important conversations. He had done this hundreds of times before, but tonight his attention was caught by Ingrid's words, by the hope in her voice, and the way the firelight made the map seem almost alive. For just an instant, he forgot to watch his feet. The loose stone that had been wobbling underfoot for weeks finally shifted. Leif stumbled, his arms windmilling as he tried to regain his balance. The bucket of ale flew from his hands in a perfect arc, its contents catching the firelight like liquid amber as it sailed through the air toward the precious map that represented their future. Time seemed to slow as the bucket tumbled through the air. Leif watched in horror as the ale spread in a golden cascade, each drop catching the firelight like tiny amber jewels before gravity claimed them. The liquid struck the precious map with a sound like rain on leather, soaking instantly into the carefully prepared parchment. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Then the explosion of voices began. "You fool!" Magnus roared, his chair scraping backward as he lunged to his feet. Months of work, ruined by a clumsy stable boy. Bjorn's walking stick struck the floor with a sharp crack. 50 years I've waited to see such detail of the western waters, and this whelp destroys it in a heartbeat. Astrid's voice cut through the anger like a blade. The spirits warned of deception and hidden things. Perhaps this is their message, that we should not trust what appears on the surface. But Leif heard none of it. He stood frozen, watching the ale seep across the map's surface, transforming Brother Aldrich's careful lines into a spreading stain of brown and gold. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, all the warnings about staying invisible, about not drawing attention, about knowing his place. He had failed in the most spectacular way possible. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words were lost in the chaos of angry voices. "I'm so sorry," Jarl Eric's voice boomed over the tumult. "Enough!" The hall fell silent again, though the tension remained thick enough to cut. "What's done is done." Shouting will not restore what's lost. Ingrid had not moved. She stood perfectly still, her hands still resting on the table's edge, her eyes fixed on the ruined map. The ale had spread across most of the parchment now, turning the carefully inked lines into a muddy brown mess. Months of work, weeks of preparation, all of it destroyed by a moment's clumsiness. But as she watched, something strange began to happen. Where the ale had soaked deepest, the parchment seemed to be changing. The brown stain was growing darker in some places, lighter in others, creating patterns that had not been there before. And beneath the surface, as if the liquid was acting like some sort of solvent, new lines were beginning to appear. "Wait," she said quietly. The men around the table were still muttering angrily, discussing what could be salvaged, whether Brother Aldrich could recreate his work, how much time they had lost. But Ingrid's voice cut through their planning. "Wait," she said again, louder this time. "Look at the map," Magnus glanced down dismissively. "There's nothing to look at, child. It's ruined." But Astrid had heard something in Ingrid's tone that made her lean forward, her wise woman's instincts suddenly alert. "What do you see?" Ingrid pointed to a section where the ale had pooled particularly deep. The original ink lines had almost disappeared, but beneath them, faint markings were becoming visible, lines that seemed to be drawn in a different ink, and that was only revealed when wet. "There," she breathed. "Do you see it?" Bjorn squinted with his good eye, then suddenly straightened. "By Thor's hammer," he whispered. "There are markings beneath the surface." The anger in the room transformed instantly into amazement. One by one, the advisors leaned forward, their attention now completely focused on what the spilled ale was revealing. Where before, there had been only Brother Aldrich's careful notations of known waters, now there appeared to be a completely different map, one that showed coastlines and islands that no living person had charted. Magnus traced one of the emerging lines with his finger, his shipwright's eye immediately recognizing the significance of what he was seeing. "These markings, they show currents I've never heard described. And look here, this island chain. If this is accurate, it would provide shelter for ships crossing the deepest waters." Astrid's voice was hushed with wonder. Hidden knowledge revealed by accident. The spirits spoke true. There was deception, but not the kind we feared. Someone concealed a second map beneath the first. Ingrid felt her heart racing as she studied the emerging patterns. The new lines were becoming clearer by the moment, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. These markings corresponded exactly to fragments she remembered from her mother's stories, tales that had seemed like mere fantasy until this moment. "My mother," she whispered. "She used to tell me about islands where the grass grew green all year and the streams never froze. She said they lay beyond the edge of every map, but that they could be found by those who knew how to read the signs the old gods had hidden in plain sight." Leif still stood frozen near the great doors, the empty bucket hanging from his nerveless fingers. The transformation of the room's mood from fury to wonder had left him feeling dizzy and confused. He had expected punishment, exile, perhaps even death for destroying something so precious. Instead, he seemed to have uncovered something that was making the clan's wisest advisors speak in hushed tones of miracles and divine intervention. Jarl Erik rose slowly from his chair, his eyes never leaving the map. The hidden markings were still emerging as the ale continued to work its way through the parchment, revealing details that grew more intricate with each passing moment. "How long has this second map been hidden?" he asked. Ingrid shook her head slowly. "I don't know." Brother Aldrich said the parchment came from an old monastery library, one that had been abandoned during the Danish raids 50 years ago. Perhaps someone hid this knowledge before the Vikings came, hoping it would be preserved for a future generation. "Or," Astrid said thoughtfully, "perhaps your mother knew more than she ever told us." Sigrid had connections to the old knowledge that went deeper than most realized. She may have found a way to preserve this information where only her daughter would discover it. The suggestion sent a chill through Ingrid. That had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the hall's walls. Her mother had indeed possessed knowledge that seemed to come from sources beyond the normal world of traders and travelers. Sigrid had known things about weather patterns, about the behavior of sea creatures, about the subtle signs that marked the presence of land beyond the horizon. If she had somehow arranged for this hidden map to come into Ingrid's hands at just the right moment, "The timing," Bjorn murmured, as if reading her thoughts. "We needed guidance about our next voyage, and here it appears, revealed by what seemed like pure accident. Either the gods favor us greatly, or someone who loved us planned this moment with extraordinary care." Magnus was studying the hidden coastlines with professional interest. These islands, if they exist where this map suggests, they would provide perfect bases for further exploration. Fresh water, timber for repairs, shelter from the worst storms. A clan could winter there safely and continue west in the spring. The room fell quiet as the full implications of the discovery settled over them. This was no longer just about a desperate voyage to find new fishing grounds or farmland. This was about the possibility of following a carefully planned route to lands that might be rich beyond their wildest dreams. But it was also about something deeper. Standing in the firelight, surrounded by the clan's most trusted advisors, Ingrid felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like her father's ceremonial cloak. This moment would be remembered for generations, the night when a stable hand's clumsiness revealed the hidden path to their future. She looked across the hall to where Leif still stood, pale and shaken by the evening's events. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw in his face the same mixture of wonder and fear that she felt in her own heart. Whatever the hidden map might lead them to, whatever adventures or dangers lay ahead, they would both be forever connected to this moment when accident became revelation. "Leif," she called softly. He started, clearly expecting condemnation despite the miraculous turn of events. "Come here," she said. "You should see what your accident has uncovered." Hesitantly, he approached the table, his eyes fixed on the map that was still revealing its secrets. Up close, the hidden markings were even more detailed than they had appeared from across the hall. Islands and coastlines stretched across the parchment in patterns that spoke of careful observation and precise measurement. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I never meant—" "I know," Ingrid said gently. "But perhaps meaning had nothing to do with it. Perhaps this was always supposed to happen, exactly as it did." As she spoke, the last of the hidden markings finished emerging from beneath the surface. The map now showed two complete routes, Brother Aldrich's careful charting of known waters, and beneath it, this mysterious guide to lands that existed beyond the edge of the world. Together, they formed a path that stretched from their own familiar fjord to destinations that promised either great fortune or great danger. The choice of which route to follow, and what that choice might cost them, now lay before them like a challenge from the gods themselves. The days following the revelation of the hidden map brought a strange energy to Clan Nordhrafn. Word of the discovery had spread through the settlement like wildfire, and everywhere Ingrid went, she found herself the center of hushed conversations and speculative glances. The stable hands whispered about divine intervention. The fishermen spoke of signs and portents. The women grinding grain wondered aloud whether this mysterious route might lead their husbands to waters rich with cod and herring. But with excitement came uncertainty, and with uncertainty came the kind of questions that kept leaders awake through the long northern nights. Ingrid found herself returning to the great hall again and again, studying the dual map by firelight and candlelight, trying to decipher meanings that seemed to shift like shadows every time she thought she understood them. The hidden markings had dried to a faint brown that was visible only when the light struck the parchment at exactly the right angle. Sometimes the lines seemed to form clear patterns of islands and safe harbors. Other times, they appeared to be nothing more than the random stains left by spilled ale. Magnus the shipwright had taken to visiting the hall each morning, bringing with him small tools and pieces of wood that he used to model the ship modifications the journey would require. His weathered hands shaped miniature hulls as he spoke of the challenges they would face on unknown waters. "The ships will need to be lighter for speed but stronger for the deep ocean swells," he explained. To Ingrid one grey morning as rain drummed against the hall's wooden walls. "We'll have to sacrifice some cargo space for extra water barrels and emergency supplies. And if we're truly sailing beyond the edge of every known chart, we'll need backup equipment for everything. Spare sails, extra rope, additional tools for repairs." His words carried the weight of decades spent building vessels that could survive the North Sea's worst moods. But there was something else in his voice, a note of excitement that Ingrid had not heard from him since she was a child, listening to his stories of distant ports and exotic cargoes. Astrid, the wise woman, brought different concerns. She appeared in the hall each evening as the sun set, carrying bundles of herbs and small carved tokens that she arranged in careful patterns while studying the map's mystical implications. "The runes speak of great change," she told Ingrid during one of these sessions, her voice low and thoughtful. "But change can bring either blessing or curse, and the signs are not clear about which we should expect. There are omens of abundance, symbols that suggest rich lands and favorable winds. But there are also warnings about losing one's way, about forgetting the path home. She paused to light a small bundle of dried sage, letting its smoke drift across the map's surface. Your mother understood these things better than I ever will. Sigrid had the gift of seeing patterns that others missed, of knowing which signs to trust and which to fear. I wish she were here to guide us through this decision. The mention of her mother always brought a familiar ache to Ingrid's chest. 5 years had passed since the wasting sickness took Sigrid, but there were still moments when Ingrid found herself turning to share a thought or ask a question, only to remember that those conversations would never happen again. Old Bjorn presented perhaps the most complex perspective of all. His experience as a navigator was invaluable, but his memories were colored by decades of voyages that had not always ended well. He had seen ships disappear beyond the horizon, never to return. He had witnessed the grief of families left waiting for loved ones who would never come home. "I've sailed farther than most," he told Ingrid one afternoon as they stood together on the shore, watching fishing boats return with their meager catch. "I've seen islands that appeared on no map and waters that behaved like no others. But I've also learned that the sea keeps its own counsel, and that confidence can become arrogance faster than a man can drown." He pointed toward the horizon with his walking stick. "That hidden map, it may be genuine guidance from someone who knew these waters well. Or it may be the fantasy of a monk who spent too many years copying tales from traveling merchants. We won't know which until we commit our ships and our lives to following it." Through all of these discussions, Leif found himself in an increasingly strange position. The young man who had lived his entire life in the shadows was suddenly being treated as someone whose presence mattered. Clan members who had never bothered to learn his name now nodded respectfully when they passed him in the settlement. Children who had once ignored him now followed him around, begging for details about the moment when he had accidentally uncovered the hidden map. The attention made him deeply uncomfortable. He had grown up believing that his role was to serve quietly and avoid notice. Now he found himself invited to sit near the great table during evening discussions, his opinions sought by people who had never cared what a stable hand might think about navigation or exploration. "You were there when it happened," Ingrid said to him one evening after the advisors had departed and they were left alone in the hall. "Oh, you saw the map change. What did you feel in that moment? What did your instincts tell you about what we were seeing?" Leif fidgeted with his rough woolen sleeves, still unused to being asked for his thoughts on matters of such importance. "I felt—" He paused, searching for words that could capture the mixture of terror and wonder that had filled him as the hidden markings emerged. "I felt like the world had suddenly become much larger than I thought it was. Like there were possibilities I had never imagined, because I never believed I was the sort of person who would be allowed to imagine them." Ingrid nodded slowly. "That's exactly how I felt, and it frightens me almost as much as it excites me." The firelight flickered across their faces as they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the choice that lay before the clan. Outside, the wind was picking up, bringing with it the salt smell of storm clouds gathering over the sea. "Do you think we're being foolish?" Ingrid asked finally, considering such a journey based on markings that might be nothing more than the stains left by spilled ale. Leif was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My mother used to say that the gods work through ordinary people doing ordinary things. She said the most important moments in life often look like accidents until you understand what they really meant." He gestured toward the map, which lay rolled carefully on a side table, protected now by oiled leather wrapping. "Maybe spilling that ale was just clumsiness. Maybe the markings are just stains. But maybe sometimes the gods choose stable hands and spilled drinks to reveal the paths that change everything." Ingrid felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "You sound like a philosopher, not a stable hand." "Perhaps," Leif said with a slight grin of his own. "The difference between the two is smaller than most people think." As they talked, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows near the hall's great doors. Magnus stood motionless, his shipwright's eyes studying not the map, but the two young people discussing it. He had built enough vessels to recognize when wood and rope would hold together under stress, and he was beginning to suspect that he was witnessing the formation of a partnership that might prove strong enough to carry their clan safely across unknown waters. But strength alone would not be enough. For the journey they were contemplating, they would also need luck, wisdom, and the favor of forces beyond any mortal understanding. Whether they possessed those qualities would only be revealed when they committed themselves to following the hidden map's mysterious guidance into waters that no member of their clan had ever sailed before. The bronze mirror had belonged to Ingrid's mother, passed down through 3 generations of women who had each found their own ways to peer into the mysteries that lay beyond the visible world. Now it sat on the wooden table in Ingrid's private chamber, its polished surface reflecting the uncertain light of a single oil lamp as she studied her own face and wondered if she possessed even a fraction of the wisdom her ancestors had carried. Sigrid had used this mirror for more than vanity. She had polished it with special herbs and spoken to it in the old tongue, seeking guidance in its depths during times when the clan faced difficult choices. Ingrid had watched her mother perform these rituals as a child, never truly understanding what she was seeing, but recognizing the reverence with which Sigrid approached the ancient bronze disc. Tonight, 3 weeks after the revelation of the hidden map, Ingrid found herself trying to remember the words her mother had whispered to the mirror's surface. The decision about whether to follow the mysterious route could not be delayed much longer. Winter was approaching, and if they were going to attempt such a voyage, they would need to leave soon or wait until spring, a delay that might mean starvation for many in the clan. As she gazed into the bronze surface, Ingrid thought she saw something flicker in its depths, not her own reflection, but shadows that moved like distant ships on a dark sea. She blinked, and the vision vanished, leaving her to wonder if exhaustion was playing tricks with her eyes or if the mirror still held some fragment of her mother's gift for seeing beyond the present moment. A soft knock at her chamber door interrupted her contemplation. "Come," she called, covering the mirror with a piece of soft cloth. Leif entered hesitantly, carrying a wooden tray with bread, cheese, and hot broth. Over the past weeks, he had gradually taken on the role of her informal assistant, bringing meals when she forgot to eat and serving as a quiet companion during the long hours she spent studying the dual map and trying to understand its implications. "The evening meal is being served in the hall," he said, setting the tray on a small table near the shuttered window. "But I thought you might prefer to eat here tonight. Magnus and Bjorn have been arguing about ship modifications for 3 hours, and Astrid keeps muttering about signs and portents." Ingrid smiled gratefully. "You know me too well already. Sometimes I think more clearly when I'm not surrounded by everyone else's certainties and fears." Leif nodded toward the covered mirror. "My grandmother had one like that. She said it showed her things that hadn't happened yet, but might if the right choices were made. Do you ever see anything in yours?" "I'm not sure," Ingrid admitted. "Sometimes I think I see images, but I can never tell if they're visions or just my own hopes and worries reflected back at me. My mother made it look so easy, but then she had gifts I may not have inherited. Maybe the gifts are there, but they work differently for you," Leif suggested as he arranged the food. "Maybe you're supposed to see different things, or see them in different ways." His words carried a thoughtfulness that still surprised Ingrid. In the weeks since the map's revelation, she had discovered that Leif possessed an intelligence that had been hidden beneath years of serving in silence. He listened carefully, observed keenly, and often noticed details that others missed. More importantly, he seemed to understand that wisdom could come from unexpected sources, a perspective that was proving invaluable as they navigated the complex decision before them. "The clan is growing restless," she said, breaking off a piece of bread and dipping it in the warm broth. "People are starting to take sides about the voyage. Some see it as a divine opportunity that we'd be fools to ignore. Others think we're risking everything on what might be an elaborate fantasy. What do you see it as?" Leif asked, Ingrid considered the question while she ate, tasting not just the food, but the weight of responsibility that seemed to flavor everything these days. "I see it as a test," she said finally, "not just of our courage or our sailing skills, but of our ability to trust in something larger than our own limited understanding." The hidden map appeared at exactly the moment we needed guidance most desperately. That could be coincidence, or it could be something more meaningful. And if it is something more meaningful, then we have to be worthy of the gift we've been given. We have to approach this voyage not as desperate refugees fleeing a bad harvest, but as people who understand that we're being offered a chance to become something greater than we've ever been before. Through the shuttered window, they could hear the sounds of the evening settling over the settlement, children being called in from play, cattle being herded to shelter, adults discussing the day's work around their own hearth fires. These were the people whose futures would be shaped by the decision Ingrid and her advisors made about the mysterious route. Their voices carried the weight of trust that had been placed in their leader's wisdom. "There's something else," Leif said quietly. "Something I haven't told anyone because I wasn't sure it mattered." Ingrid looked up from her food, hearing something in his tone that made her pay closer attention. "The night I spilled the ale," he continued, "I had been thinking about my father, about how he died in a raid that brought the clan nothing but grief, about how he never had the chance to be part of something that might actually make life better for his people, instead of just taking from others." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts like a man preparing to lift a heavy burden. "When I saw that ale spreading across the map, my first thought wasn't about the disaster I had caused. It was about how my father would have been ashamed that his son had destroyed something that represented hope for the clan's future. But then, when the hidden markings appeared," he shook his head, still amazed by the memory. "I felt like maybe he was there somehow, helping to guide my clumsiness towards something good." Ingrid set down her spoon and studied Leif's face in the lamplight. "You think your father's spirit had something to do with revealing the hidden map?" "I think the dead care about the living more than we realize. And I think sometimes they find ways to help us discover the paths we need to follow, even when we're too frightened or too proud to look for them ourselves." His words resonated with something deep in Ingrid's heart, a longing for connection with her own departed mother, a hope that Sigrid's wisdom might still be available to guide them through this crucial decision. Perhaps the bronze mirror was not the only way the dead communicated with the living. Perhaps they also worked through spilled ale and hidden maps and the chance conversations that revealed truths people had been carrying without realizing their importance. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then maybe we're not making this decision alone. Maybe we have help from people who understand better than we do what this voyage really means." Outside, the wind was picking up again, carrying with it the promise of the season's first serious storm. Soon the decision would have to be made: follow the hidden map into unknown waters, or wait for spring and risk the consequences of another season of scarcity. But tonight, sitting in the warm light of the oil lamp with food and companionship and the growing certainty that they were part of something larger than themselves, the choice seemed less like a burden and more like a doorway opening onto possibilities they were only beginning to understand. The carved runestone stood at the settlement's edge, where the path to the harbor met the road that led inland to the mountain passes. For generations, it had served as a gathering place for important announcements, its weathered surface bearing symbols that spoke of journeys taken and oaths sworn by ancestors whose names had passed into legend. Today, as grey clouds gathered overhead and the first cold winds of the approaching season whistled through the settlement, it would witness a decision that would determine the fate of Clan Nordhrafn. Ingrid stood before the stone, her hands resting on its carved surface as she felt the weight of history and expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Around her, the entire clan had gathered, men and women, children and elders, craftsmen and farmers and fishermen, all waiting to hear whether their leaders had decided to risk everything on a voyage into the unknown. The past week had been filled with intense discussions that sometimes stretched late into the night. Magnus had presented detailed plans for modifying their strongest ships, calculating cargo capacity, and estimating the time needed for various stages of the journey. Astrid had consulted every source of mystical guidance available to her, studying the patterns of birds in flight and the way ice formed on still water. Bjorn had shared stories of previous expeditions, both successful and disastrous, trying to help them understand the real costs of exploration. But in the end, the decision had come down to something simpler and more profound than technical calculations or mystical omens. It had come down to faith. Faith in the hidden map's authenticity, faith in their own abilities, and faith that sometimes the greatest opportunities required the greatest courage. Jarl Erik stepped forward to stand beside his daughter, his presence lending weight to the moment. His silver beard caught the morning light as he raised his hand for silence, though the crowd had already fallen quiet in anticipation of his words. "My people," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled faces with the authority of decades of leadership. "We gather at the runestone today to announce a decision that will affect every family among us. You know the challenges we face, the poor harvests, the diminishing fish runs, the hard winter that approaches. You also know of the gift that was revealed to us, the hidden map that may show a path to lands of plenty." He paused, letting his gaze move across the faces before him. These were people who had followed his leadership through raids and famines, through seasons of abundance and times of desperate scarcity. They trusted him to make choices that honored both their safety and their courage. "After much deliberation and prayer," he continued, "we have decided that Clan Nordhrafn will follow the hidden route. We will prepare our finest ships and choose our most skilled sailors for a voyage that may take us farther from home than any of our people have traveled before." The announcement sent a ripple of reaction through the crowd. Some faces showed relief and excitement. These were the people who had grown tired of struggling against declining resources and were ready to risk everything for the chance of a better life. Others displayed worry and fear, parents thinking of children who might be left orphans, spouses imagining long separations, elders remembering stories of expeditions that had ended in tragedy. Ingrid stepped forward, knowing that her words would be crucial in helping the clan understand not just what they had decided, but why they believed it was the right choice. "I know this decision frightens some of you," she said, her voice clear and steady, despite the emotions churning in her chest. "It frightens me as well. But fear is not always a sign that we should avoid something. Sometimes it's a sign that what we're considering is important enough to matter." She gestured toward the harbor, where their ships rode at anchor in the grey water. "Those vessels have carried our people through countless storms and brought them safely home again. The men who will sail them have navigated by star and sun through waters that would challenge the most experienced captains. We are not embarking on this voyage as inexperienced dreamers, but as skilled seafarers following a route that may have been preserved for us by those who understood both its challenges and its possibilities." Magnus stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "The ships will be ready within a fortnight," he announced. "We'll take 3 vessels, the Raven's Wing, the Storm Dancer, and the Sea Wolf. Each will be modified for the long voyage and provisioned for a journey that may last many months." And the crews called out Olaf the helmsman, whose family had been navigating these waters for 5 generations. "Volunteers only," Jarl Erik replied firmly. "No man or woman will be compelled to risk their life on this venture. Those who choose to stay will be needed here to maintain the settlement and care for those who cannot make such a journey." Astrid raised her voice from where she stood near the runestone's base. "The signs favor departure during the next new moon. The weather patterns suggest favorable winds, and the mystical indicators point toward a time of revelation and discovery. If we delay much longer, winter storms will make departure impossible until spring." This news added urgency to the decision. 2 weeks was barely enough time to complete the ship modifications, gather supplies, and make the personal choices that would determine who would go and who would stay. Families would need to decide whether to risk separation or face the dangers of the voyage together. Leif found himself studying the faces in the crowd, trying to read the emotions that flickered across them like shadows. He saw determination in the eyes of young men who had grown restless with the limitations of their current life. He saw grief in the faces of mothers who understood they might be saying goodbye to sons who would never return. He saw hope in the expressions of crafters and traders who dreamed of markets and opportunities beyond anything their isolated settlement could provide. But most of all, he saw trust in their leaders' wisdom, trust in their own abilities, and trust that the hidden map represented genuine guidance rather than elaborate deception. There will be a place on one of the ships for anyone who possesses skills needed for such a voyage, Ingrid announced. We will need sailors and navigators, certainly, but also craftsmen who can make repairs in unknown harbors, hunters who can find food in unfamiliar lands, and healers who can treat injuries and illnesses far from home. She paused, her eyes finding Leif's face in the crowd. We will also need people who understand that sometimes the most important discoveries come from seeing familiar things in new ways, people who know that wisdom can emerge from unexpected sources. The meaning of her words was clear to those who had heard the story of how the hidden map was revealed. Leif felt heat rise in his cheeks as dozens of eyes turned toward him. But he also felt something else, a growing sense that perhaps his clumsiness had been the first step in a journey that would transform not just his own life, but the destiny of everyone he had ever known. As the crowd began to disperse, families and friends clustering together to discuss what the announcement meant for their own futures, Ingrid remained by the runestone. The carved symbols seemed to pulse with significance in the shifting light, reminders of all the journeys that had begun with someone standing in this exact spot and choosing to trust in possibilities that lay beyond the horizon. The wooden compass had been carved by Leif's grandfather from a single piece of driftwood, found on the shore after a particularly violent storm, and like the iron needles used by wealthy merchants, this simple device relied on a magnetized sliver of metal floated in a shallow bowl of oil. But it had guided fishing boats safely home through fog and darkness for more than 30 years. Now it sat on the workbench in Magnus's shipyard, one of dozens of instruments being checked and rechecked as the final preparations for the voyage neared completion. 2 weeks had passed since the announcement at the runestone, and the settlement had transformed into a hive of focused activity. The sound of hammers and saws echoed from the harbor as Magnus and his apprentices worked to modify the ships for the long journey ahead. Women moved through the settlement, gathering herbs and preserving foods that would last for months at sea. Children helped their parents sort through possessions, deciding what could be carried and what must be left behind. But beneath the surface of this industrious preparation, tensions were growing. The reality of the voyage was beginning to sink in, and with it came the kind of second thoughts and family conflicts that threatened to tear apart the careful unity that had supported the initial decision. Leif discovered this firsthand when he found his mother, Gudrun, sitting alone in their small dwelling, staring at a bundle of his father's possessions that she had wrapped in oiled leather many years ago. "You don't have to come," he said quietly, settling beside her on the low wooden bench that served as both seat and storage chest. "The voyage isn't meant for everyone. Staying behind to help maintain the settlement is just as important as sailing to unknown lands." Gudrun looked up at him with eyes that held both pride and sorrow. "It's not about whether I have to come," she said. "It's about whether I can bear to let you go alone. You're all I have left of your father, and the sea has already taken him from me once." Her words carried the weight of grief that had never fully healed. Leif's father had been lost during a raid that went badly wrong, leaving behind a wife who had to raise a son on the charity of the clan, and the memory of a husband who would never see his child grow to manhood. The hidden map. This isn't like the raids that took father. Leif said carefully. This is about discovery, not conquest. About finding new opportunities, not taking what belongs to others. The sea doesn't care about our intentions, Gudrun replied. Storms don't distinguish between raiders and explorers. If something goes wrong out there, you'll be just as dead, whether you were seeking treasure or seeking new lands. Her bluntness struck him like a physical blow, but Leif recognized the truth in her words. The voyage they were planning carried real risks, and pretending otherwise would be both foolish and disrespectful to those who were being asked to face those dangers. Then why are you even considering coming? He asked. Gudrun was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the leather wrapping that protected her husband's few remaining possessions. Because, she said finally, I've spent 20 years living in the shadow of loss, and I'm tired of making every decision based on fear of what might go wrong. Maybe it's time to make a choice based on what might go right. Similar conversations were taking place throughout the settlement as the departure date approached. Magnus found himself mediating disputes between crew members who had different ideas about ship modifications and cargo priorities. Astrid was consulted by families seeking guidance about whether the signs favored their participation in the voyage. Even Jarl Erik spent long hours listening to individual concerns and trying to address doubts, without undermining the confidence necessary for such a bold undertaking. But perhaps the most significant tension was developing between those who saw the voyage as a desperate escape from declining conditions and those who viewed it as a spiritual quest guided by divine intervention. These different perspectives led to fundamental disagreements about everything from the selection of crew members to the interpretation of weather signs. Ingrid found herself caught in the middle of these conflicts, trying to maintain unity while acknowledging the legitimate concerns being raised by various factions within the clan. The hidden map had provided them with a destination, but it could not resolve the human complications that arose whenever people faced uncertain futures together. One evening, as she stood on the harbour dock, watching the modified ships take shape under Magnus's supervision, she was joined by Astrid, who carried with her the carved bone tokens she used for divination. The runes are showing mixed messages, the wise woman said without preamble. There are signs of great success, but also warnings about division within the group. The spirits seem to be saying that the physical journey will be less challenging than the human relationships we'll need to navigate. Ingrid nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. People are scared. When we're scared, we sometimes turn against each other instead of supporting each other. How do we prevent that from destroying us before we even leave the harbour? Astrid scattered the bone tokens on the dock's wooden planks, studying the patterns they formed in the torchlight. The old stories say that successful voyages require more than skilled sailors and sturdy ships. They require what the ancients called the bond of shared purpose, a connection between crew members that goes deeper than individual fears or ambitions. And how does one create such a bond? Usually through shared hardship that proves everyone's commitment to the common goal. But sometimes, Astrid said, gathering up her tokens, it can be forged through shared ceremony that honors both the magnitude of what's being attempted and the courage of those who choose to attempt it. Her suggestion sparked an idea that had been forming in the back of Ingrid's mind for several days. The clan needed something that would transform their individual decisions to join the voyage into a collective commitment to its success. They needed a ritual that would mark the transition from Nordhrafn villagers to members of an expedition that might change the course of their people's history. That night, she called together the ship captains and senior crew members who had volunteered for the voyage. In the great hall, with the hidden map spread before them and the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, she outlined her proposal. Before we sail, she said, we should hold a ceremony that binds us together not just as clan members, but as partners in this specific quest. Each person who chooses to join the voyage should publicly pledge their commitment not only to reaching the lands shown on the hidden map, but to supporting their shipmates through whatever challenges we encounter. Magnus leaned forward, his shipwright's practical mind already working through the implications. A crew that's sworn to support each other will work better together when storms test both ships and tempers. Bjorn nodded his agreement. I've sailed with men who were bound only by wages, and I've sailed with men who were bound by oaths. The difference between the two can mean the difference between survival and disaster when circumstances become truly difficult. Astrid smiled, recognizing the wisdom in Ingrid's proposal. Such a ceremony would also honor the spiritual aspects of our journey. We're not just following a map. We're following what may be guidance from sources beyond our normal understanding. That deserves acknowledgement and respect. As they planned the details of the oath-taking ceremony, Leif listened from his position near the hall's great doors, understanding that he was witnessing the transformation of an idea into a reality that would define the rest of his life. The iron key had been hidden beneath the floorboards of Ingrid's chamber for 5 years, wrapped in a piece of silk that still carried the faint scent of her mother's favorite herbs. Sigrid had pressed it into her daughter's hand during the final days of her illness, speaking in whispers about secrets that must be preserved until the right moment came to reveal them. Until tonight, 3 days before the planned departure, Ingrid had never found the courage to discover what the key unlocked. But the approaching voyage had given new urgency to her mother's cryptic final words. If Sigrid had indeed known about the hidden map, if she had somehow arranged for it to come into Ingrid's possession at exactly the right moment, then perhaps there were other preparations she had. A maid, other guidance she had left for a daughter, who would one day need to lead their people into unknown waters. The key was smaller than those used for the settlement's main buildings, suggesting it opened something personal rather than communal. Ingrid had spent the past hour searching her mother's former possessions, testing the key against various chests and containers, until she remembered the carved wooden box that sat on a high shelf in the corner of the chamber, a box she had never seen opened, never thought to question. Now, as storm clouds gathered outside and the wind howled around the settlement's buildings, she lifted the box down and fitted the iron key into its hidden lock. It turned with a soft click that seemed to echo through the chamber, like the sound of destiny finally revealing itself. Inside the box, wrapped in layers of oiled leather and soft wool, were objects that made Ingrid's breath catch in her throat. The first was a small journal bound in sealskin, its pages covered with her mother's careful handwriting in the old runic script. The second was a necklace of amber beads, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the lamplight. The third was another map, not drawn on parchment like the one that had been revealed by spilled ale, but etched into a piece of whalebone, with tools so precise that every line seemed to have been placed with mathematical accuracy. But it was the fourth item that truly shook her. Nestled at the bottom of the box was a small glass vial filled with dark liquid, and beside it a note written in her mother's distinctive hand, "For the map that waits beneath the surface. Use when the moment of revelation arrives. The gods work through those who have the courage to help them." Ingrid sank into her chair, her hands trembling as the implications of her discovery washed over her. The hidden map had not been revealed by accident. Her mother had somehow arranged for it to be concealed beneath Brother Aldrich's careful drawings, and she had prepared the means for its revelation. Leif's clumsiness had not been divine intervention. It had been the natural result of a plan that Sigrid had set in motion years before her death. She opened the journal with reverent care, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting that brought back memories of bedtime stories and whispered lullabies. The first entry was dated just weeks after Ingrid's 15th birthday, when her mother's illness was beginning to show its first subtle signs. "The dreams have become clearer," the entry read. "I see my daughter standing before ships that will carry our people to lands of plenty. But the journey cannot begin until she understands that some knowledge must be earned rather than simply inherited. The map from the monastery holds two routes, one that leads to known dangers and one that leads to unknown possibilities. She must choose which path to follow, but first she must prove worthy of the choice. Ingrid's heart pounded as she read page after page of her mother's careful planning. Sigrid had not simply foreseen the need for the voyage. She had orchestrated every detail of how it would unfold. She had arranged for Brother Aldrich to acquire the parchment from the abandoned monastery, not knowing that it already contained the hidden map drawn by some long-dead explorer. She had prepared the special ink that would reveal the concealed markings when exposed to ale. She had even influenced events to ensure that Leif would be serving drinks that particular evening, though the journal did not explain how she had managed that seemingly impossible feat. My daughter must learn to trust in guidance that comes from unexpected sources. Another entry read, "The stable boy carries no noble blood, but he possesses something more valuable, the ability to see possibilities where others see only limitations. When the time comes for revelation, it will be his hands that uncover the path forward. Though he will not understand his role until much later." The whalebone map proved to be even more detailed than the one revealed by the spilled ale. It showed not just the route to the mysterious lands, but also the locations of islands where fresh water could be found, the seasonal patterns of winds and currents, and even warnings about specific dangers. Rocky shores hidden by morning mists, channels where unexpected tides could drive ships onto reefs, areas where sea monsters were known to hunt for unwary sailors. But perhaps most significantly, the bone map included markings that indicated return routes, multiple paths back to familiar waters that would allow successful explorers to bring news of their discoveries to the people they had left behind. This was not a map for desperate refugees fleeing a dying land. This was a chart for systematic exploration that could establish trade routes and colonies while maintaining connections to the homeland. As Ingrid studied these intricate details, she realized that her mother had not simply foreseen a single voyage of discovery. She had envisioned the beginning of an expansion that could transform Clan Nordhrafn from a struggling settlement into the center of a new trading network that spanned unknown seas. The amber necklace, when she lifted it to the lamplight, revealed another layer of her mother's planning. Each bead was carved with navigation symbols that corresponded to specific landmarks shown on the bone map. Worn together, they would serve as a backup navigation system, a way to find crucial waypoints, even if the physical map was lost or damaged during the voyage. But it was the final entry in the journal that truly revealed the scope of Sigrid's vision. "I will not live to see the fulfillment of what I have set in motion, but perhaps that is as it should be. This journey must belong to the new generation, not to those who are bound by the limitations of what we have always known. My daughter will face choices that I cannot make for her, dangers that I cannot protect her from, and opportunities that I can only imagine. But she will not face them alone. The hidden map will provide the route, the stable boy will provide the catalyst for discovery, and the spirits of those who love her will provide the courage she needs to trust in. Possibilities that extend beyond the edge of every known chart." Ingrid closed the journal and sat in the silence of her chamber, listening to the storm winds that rattled the shutters, and feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle passed down through generations. Her mother had given her far more than maps and navigation. Tools. She had given her a destiny that stretched beyond mere survival into the realm of transformation. The planned voyage was no longer just about finding new fishing grounds or farmland to sustain their clan through hard winters. It was about becoming the kind of people who could bridge the gap between the known and unknown worlds, who could carry the best of their heritage into territories that offered possibilities beyond anything they had previously imagined. But with this expanded understanding came new doubts. Was she truly worthy of the trust her mother had placed in her? Did she possess the wisdom and courage necessary to lead not just a single expedition, but the beginning of an expansion that might echo through history? And perhaps most importantly, how could she share this revelation with her companions without destroying the natural unity that had grown from their shared belief in the accidental discovery of the hidden map? Outside, the storm continued to build, as if the very elements were responding to the magnitude of what had been revealed. In 3 days, the ships would depart on a journey that everyone believed had been inspired by a fortunate accident. Only Ingrid now knew that they were actually fulfilling a destiny that had been carefully planned by someone who understood that the most important discoveries must appear to happen naturally, even when they are the result of profound wisdom and meticulous preparation. The question that remained was whether she would honor her mother's careful planning by allowing the voyage to proceed as if nothing had changed, or whether the crew deserved to know that they were not just following a map, but fulfilling a vision that reached far beyond their own immediate hopes and fears. The ceremonial horn had been carved from the tusk of a walrus, killed by Ingrid's great-grandfather during his legendary voyage to the icelands of the far north. For 3 generations, it had been used to summon the clan for the most momentous occasions, declarations of war, announcements of peace, and the rare ceremonies that marked transitions from one era of their people's history to another. Now it would call them together for what might be the most significant gathering in their collective memory. Dawn was breaking grey and cold over the settlement as Ingrid stood at the harbour's edge, the ancient horn heavy in her hands and the weight of her mother's revelations even heavier on her heart. 2 days had passed since she had discovered Sigrid's hidden preparations. 2 days of wrestling with the question of how much truth her companions could bear and still maintain the courage necessary for the voyage ahead. She had spent those days watching the final preparations with new eyes, seeing not just the practical work of readying ships and supplies, but the fulfillment of a destiny that her mother had set in motion with careful precision. Magnus completed the modifications to the 3 vessels, reinforcing their hulls and adding the specialized equipment needed for long-distance navigation. Astrid gathered the herbs and remedies that might prove crucial for maintaining health during months at sea. Bjorn worked with the volunteer navigators, teaching them the subtle signs and techniques that could mean the difference between finding safe harbor and sailing into disaster. But it was Leif's transformation that most clearly illustrated how Sigrid's plan was, unfolding exactly as she had foreseen. The young man, who had lived his entire life in the shadows, was emerging as one of the expedition's most valuable members. Not because of any special skills he possessed, but because of his unique perspective on what they were attempting. His accidental revelation of the hidden map had given him a kind of moral authority among the crew. He was the person who had uncovered their destiny, and others looked to him for signs of confidence or doubt about the journey ahead. What they saw was someone who had moved beyond the shame of his clumsiness to embrace the possibility that even the most unlikely people could play crucial roles in shaping their clan's future. Leif spent his days learning seamanship from experienced sailors, studying navigation techniques with Bjorn, and helping Magnus with the technical aspects of ship preparation. But more importantly, he had become the voice of optimism among a group of people who were struggling to maintain their courage as departure approached. He's becoming the leader I always hoped someone would be, Gudrun confided to Ingrid as they watched Leif directing a group of younger men in the proper loading of supplies. Not because he commands others, but because he inspires them to see possibilities they hadn't considered before. Now, as the time for the oath-taking ceremony arrived, Ingrid raised the ancient horn to her lips and sent its deep, resonant call across the settlement. The sound rolled across the water and echoed off the surrounding hills, summoning everyone who would be affected by this day's events, those who would sail and those who would stay behind, those who supported the voyage and those who still harbored doubts about its wisdom. They gathered at the harbor in the grey morning light, more than 200 people representing every family and craft guild in the clan. The 3 modified ships rode at anchor nearby, their masts and rigging dark against the cloudy sky, their hulls bearing the scars of hasty but skilled modifications. On the dock, between the assembled crowd and the waiting vessels, a simple altar had been constructed from stones taken from the sacred places that dotted their homeland. A symbolic bridge between the familiar, spiritual centers they were leaving and the unknown territories they hoped to reach. Jarl Erik stepped forward first, his ceremonial cloak whipping in the wind as he addressed the gathering. "Today, we transform intention into commitment," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "Those who have chosen to join this expedition will swear oaths that bind them not just to the success of the voyage, but to the welfare of their companions. This is not a journey for individual glory, but a quest that will succeed or fail based on our ability to support each other through whatever challenges we encounter." One by one, the expedition members approached the stone altar to make their pledges. Magnus swore to maintain the ships regardless of conditions, to share his knowledge freely, and to put the safety of his crew above his own comfort. Astrid promised to provide spiritual guidance and healing without favoritism, to read the signs honestly even when they brought unwelcome news, and to preserve the rituals that connected them to their homeland. Bjorn vowed to navigate true courses regardless of weather, to teach others his skills rather than hoarding them, and to value the lives of young sailors as highly as his own survival. The ceremony continued as each volunteer stepped forward to make their personal commitment to the expedition's success. Fishermen swore to share their knowledge of reading water and weather. Craftsmen promised to maintain equipment and solve problems with whatever materials were available. Hunters pledged to find food in unfamiliar territories and to teach others the skills they possessed. When Leif's turn came, he approached the altar with visible nervousness, clearly uncomfortable with the attention focused on him, but determined to fulfill his role in the ceremony. His oath, when it came, was simpler than most, but carried particular weight because of his unique position in the expedition's origin story. "I swear to remember that great discoveries often come from unexpected sources," he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I promise to look for possibilities that others might miss, to support those who take risks for the common good, and to trust that even our mistakes can serve purposes larger than our individual understanding." His words drew murmurs of approval from the assembled crowd, many of whom had come to see his accidental revelation of the hidden map as a sign that the gods favored their enterprise. But Ingrid, listening from her position near the altar, heard in his oath an echo of her mother's journal entries about the need to trust guidance that came from unlikely sources. Finally, it was her turn to step forward and make the commitment that would formally begin the expedition. As she approached the stone altar, she felt the weight of the amber necklace beneath her clothing, the physical reminder of the additional knowledge she carried. The question that had tormented her for 2 days returned with renewed intensity should she reveal her mother's planning. To the people who were about to risk their lives following what they believed was accidental guidance, standing before the altar with the wind pulling at her cloak and the expectant faces of her people focused on her, Ingrid made her choice. The truth about Sigrid's preparations might inspire some, but it would certainly burden others with doubts about authenticity and manipulation. The courage that had grown from their shared belief in the accidental discovery was too precious to risk destroying with revelations that, however true, might fragment the unity they had built. "I swear to lead this expedition with wisdom and courage," she declared, her voice carrying across the water to where the ships waited. "I promise to trust in the guidance we have received, whether it comes from maps or dreams or the unexpected insights of those who see with fresh eyes. I vow to remember that we sail not as desperate refugees, but as explorers carrying the best of our heritage into territories that offer possibilities beyond our current imagining." She paused, feeling the weight of her mother's planning and her own decision to honor it through silence rather than revelation. "And I swear that no matter how far we travel or what wonders we discover, We will never forget the home and people that gave us the courage to seek new horizons." As her words echoed across the harbour, Astrid stepped forward with a burning torch taken from the sacred fire that had burned continuously in their great hall for generations. This flame would travel with them, carried in specially designed braziers that could maintain fire even in the worst weather. As long as it burned, they would carry with them a living connection to the spiritual center of their homeland. The ceremony concluded with the loading of the final supplies and the boarding of crew members who would begin the voyage immediately. The weather signs suggested that favorable winds would develop within hours, and Bjorn was anxious to take advantage of conditions that might not return for several days. But even as the practical work of departure began, Ingrid found herself thinking about the larger implications of what they were attempting. They were not just following a map to new territories, they were fulfilling a vision that reached across generations, carrying forward the hopes and wisdom of those who had come before, while creating possibilities for those who would come after. Standing on the dock as the ships prepared to depart, she felt the presence of her mother's spirit as strongly as if Sigrid were standing beside her. The hidden knowledge, the careful planning, the trust placed in her daughter's judgment, all of it had led to this moment when dream became reality and the future opened before them like an uncharted sea. The time for preparation and ceremony had ended. Now came the real test, whether their courage and unity would prove strong enough to carry them safely across unknown waters to the lands that waited beyond the edge of every map they had ever known. The dragon-headed prow of the ravens, wing cut through waters unlike any they had seen in 6 weeks of sailing. Here, beyond the edge of every known chart, the sea itself seemed different, deeper blue than the familiar northern waters, warmer despite the season, and filled with currents that moved in patterns that challenged even Bjorn's decades of navigation experience. Schools of silver fish swirled beneath the surface like living clouds, and seabirds with unfamiliar markings wheeled overhead, their cries carrying notes that seemed almost musical. Ingrid stood at the ship's bow, her mother's amber necklace warm against her skin as she studied the horizon, where something that might be land shimmered in the distance. After weeks of following the hidden map's guidance through increasingly strange waters, they had reached the coordinates where the whalebone chart promised they would find the first of the legendary islands, way stations that would provide fresh water, timber for repairs, and shelter from the ocean storms that could destroy even the sturdiest vessels. But what lay ahead was not the simple island they had expected. By the gods! Magnus breathed from his position at the steering oar, his shipwright's eyes trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Those aren't natural formations. As the raven's wing drew closer, followed by the storm dancer and sea wolf, the truth of what awaited them became undeniable. Rising from the sea ahead was not just an island, but the remains of a massive construction that dwarfed anything their people had ever attempted. Stone towers reached toward the sky like the fingers of buried giants, their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the changing light. Harbors had been carved from living rock with a precision that spoke of tools and techniques beyond anything in their experience. "It's a city," Leif said wonderingly from his position at the rigging, "or what's left of one." Astrid moved to the bow beside Ingrid, her wise woman's senses alert to currents of power that had nothing to do with wind and tide. "The spirits here are old," she murmured, her voice tight with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Whatever people built this place, they possessed knowledge that we've lost, or perhaps never had." The 3 ships approached cautiously, their crews scanning the ancient structures for signs of current habitation while marveling at the engineering achievements that surrounded them. Massive stone breakwaters protected harbors that could have sheltered 100 vessels. Channels had been carved through coral reefs with mathematical precision. Fresh water flowed from carved spouts, fed by springs that emerged from deep within the rock formations. But it was the silence that proved most unsettling. No smoke rose from cooking fires. No voices echoed across the water. No movement suggested that anything larger than seabirds lived among the towering ruins. The city, for city it clearly was, despite its impossible age, appeared to have been abandoned for centuries. As they maneuvered into the largest harbour, Ingrid felt the weight of discovery settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her mother's hidden map had led them not just to new lands, but to evidence of a civilization that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world beyond their familiar seas. The implications were staggering, if such places existed. If people had once possessed the knowledge to build on such a scale, then what other wonders might lie, scattered across the unexplored portions of the world? "We'll anchor here for the night," she called to the other ships, her voice carrying clearly across the still water. "Tomorrow we'll explore what can be explored safely. But tonight we keep watch and try to understand what we've found." Magnus expertly guided the Raven's Wing to a stone quay that seemed to have been designed for exactly their type of vessel, its proportions perfect for northern longships, despite having been carved by hands that had never seen such craft. The other ships followed, their crews working in the strange silence that seemed to muffle even ordinary sounds. As they secured their vessels and began the process of making camp, Leif found himself studying the carved symbols that covered every visible surface of the ancient structures. Unlike the runes of his own people, these markings seemed to flow like water, curving and spiraling in patterns that suggested meaning beyond his ability to comprehend. "What do you think happened to them?" he asked Ingrid as they stood together on the quay, watching their companions unload supplies with unusual quietness. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "But I suspect we're about to learn something that changes how we understand the world we live in." Above them, the carved towers caught the last light of sunset, their surfaces glowing with an inner warmth that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight. Whatever secrets this place held, whatever knowledge its builders had possessed, the expedition that had begun with spilled. Hidden a hidden map was about to discover that some destinations were more significant than the travelers who reached them could possibly imagine. The real test of their courage was only beginning. The crystal chamber lay deep within the largest tower, reached by a spiral staircase carved from the living rock with such precision that no mortar had been needed to hold the stones together. As Ingrid descended the ancient steps by torchlight, her mother's amber necklace grew warm against her skin, each bead seeming to resonate with energies that pulsed through the tower's walls, like a slow, steady heartbeat. They had spent 3 days exploring the ruins, mapping the layout of the ancient city and cataloguing wonders that challenged everything they thought they knew about human achievement. Magnus had marveled at harbour mechanisms that could raise and lower massive stone gates to control tidal flow. Astrid had discovered gardens where exotic plants still grew in carefully designed patterns, fed by irrigation systems that drew fresh water from deep springs. Bjorn had found astronomical instruments more precise than anything he had ever imagined possible, but it was Leif who had noticed that the symbols covering the walls seemed to change when viewed from different angles, and who had realized that the patterns formed a kind of map leading to the chamber they were now approaching. "The markings on your necklace," he had observed earlier that morning as they studied the tower's entrance. "They match some of the symbols carved around this doorway. Your mother must have known about this place when she designed those amber beads." Now, as they reached the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves standing before doors made of a metal that gleamed like silver, but felt warm to the touch. The same flowing symbols that decorated the city's outer structures were inlaid here in what appeared to be gold, creating patterns that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight. Ingrid approached the doors slowly, feeling the pull of destiny as strongly as she had ever felt anything in her life. When she pressed her palm against the warm metal, the doors swung open silently, revealing a chamber that took her breath away. The room beyond was perfectly circular, its domed ceiling covered with star charts more detailed than any navigator had ever dreamed of creating. But these were not maps of familiar constellations. They showed star patterns from different seasons, different latitudes, different perspectives that could only have been created by people who had traveled far beyond the boundaries of any known world. In the center of the chamber stood a table carved from a single piece of crystal, its surface covered with what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of the entire world. Islands and continents were represented in perfect detail, connected by lines that showed ocean currents, wind patterns, and migration routes of sea creatures. Some of the land masses were familiar. She could recognize the coastlines of her homeland and the neighboring territories. But others showed places that existed beyond the edge of every map their people had ever created. "This is what your mother saw in her dreams," Astrid whispered, her voice filled with wonder as she studied the crystal map. This is why she was so certain that the hidden route would lead to something extraordinary. Around the chamber's walls, shelves held scrolls and books written in the flowing script they had been seeing throughout the city. Most were in languages none of them could read, but some contained diagrams and illustrations that transcended the barriers of written words, designs for ships that could sail farther and faster than anything they had ever built, instruments that could predict weather patterns weeks in advance, techniques for preserving food and purifying water that could revolutionize long-distance travel. But it was the discovery that Leif made while examining the chamber's far wall that truly revealed the magnitude of what they had found. Hidden behind a section of carved stone that swung away at his touch was an alcove containing dozens of small glass vials, each filled with different colored liquids and labeled with symbols that matched the markings on Ingrid's amber necklace. "Look at this," he called, his voice tight with excitement and apprehension. He held up one of the vials, its contents glowing with a soft blue light. "The symbol on the label, it's the same one that was carved on the bead your mother used to mark safe harbors." Ingrid compared the vial's marking to the corresponding bead on her necklace, confirming what Leif had discovered. Her mother had not just known about this place, she had been here, or had somehow gained access to knowledge that could only have come from this chamber. As they examined the other vials, the scope of Sigrid's preparation became clear. Each container held a different substance, some that glowed with their own light, others that seemed to shift and change color as they watched, still others that appeared perfectly ordinary until held up to the crystal map. When they revealed hidden properties that defied understanding, "She left us more than just maps and navigation tools," Ingrid said slowly, the truth of their situation finally becoming clear. "She left us access to knowledge that could change everything, not just for our clan, but for everyone who sails the northern seas." Magnus studied the ship designs, carved into the chamber walls with growing excitement. "These vessels, they're built for deep ocean travel, but they incorporate principles I've never seen before. If we could understand how to apply these techniques," Astrid nodded toward the star charts overhead, "and this astronomical knowledge, it would allow us to navigate in waters where no familiar constellations are visible. We could explore regions that have been unreachable because we lacked the tools to find our way home again." Standing in that crystal chamber, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved wonders beyond their imagination, the members of the expedition faced a choice that would determine not just their own futures, but the destiny of their people for generations to come. They had found the lands promised by the hidden map, but they had also discovered something far more significant, proof that the world contained possibilities they had never dared to dream about. The great hall of Clan Nordhrafn had never seen such a gathering. Word of the expedition's return had spread beyond their own settlement, drawing visitors from neighboring clans who came to hear first-hand accounts of the discoveries that were already being whispered about in ports and markets throughout the northern territories. The familiar walls, which had witnessed centuries of feasts and councils, now hosted discussions that would reshape how their people understood the world beyond their familiar fjords. Ingrid stood once again before the massive oak table where the hidden map had first been revealed. But now the surface held treasures that made that original parchment seem like a child's drawing. Beside the crystal navigation tools and star charts they had brought back from the ancient city lay samples of the exotic substances they had found. Vials that glowed with steady light, metals that remained warm regardless of temperature, and seeds from plants that promised to grow in soil too poor for traditional crops. 6 months had passed since their return. 6 months of careful study and gradual implementation of the knowledge they had acquired. The changes were already visible throughout the settlement. New ship designs based on the ancient principles were taking shape in Magnus's expanded shipyard. Gardens planted with seeds from the crystal chamber were producing vegetables that thrived despite the early onset of winter. Navigation instruments crafted according to the recovered designs had allowed fishing. Boats to venture farther from shore while maintaining perfect knowledge of their position. But perhaps the most significant change was in the people themselves. The successful voyage had transformed Clan Nordhrafn from a struggling settlement into a destination for those seeking knowledge and opportunity. Young people from distant territories arrived regularly, hoping to learn the new shipbuilding techniques or to join the crews being assembled for follow-up expeditions. Experienced navigators came to study the star charts that promised to open previously unreachable waters. Even scholars from the southern monasteries sent representatives to examine the ancient texts and try to decipher their mathematical principles. Leif had perhaps changed most of all. The young man who had once served ale in silence now found himself teaching navigation techniques to sea captains twice his age. His unique insights into the ancient symbols making him one of the most valuable interpreters of the recovered knowledge. His mother, Gudrun, often sat in the hall's corner during these sessions, her face glowing with pride as she watched her son share wisdom that he had helped to discover. "The third expedition departs next spring," Ingrid announced to the assembled visitors and clan members. "We now have enough knowledge to establish permanent way stations at 3 of the ancient sites, creating safe harbors for those who wish to explore even farther into the unknown regions." Magnus stepped forward from his position near the great fireplace, his hands stained with the exotic oils and resins they had learned to use in their improved shipbuilding techniques. "The new vessels will be able to carry larger crews and more supplies while sailing faster and handling rough weather better than anything our people have built before. What started as a desperate voyage to find new fishing grounds has become the foundation for exploration that could continue for generations." Astrid nodded her agreement from where she sat, surrounded by young women learning to identify and prepare the new herbs and remedies they had discovered. "The spiritual knowledge we've recovered is equally valuable. The ancient people understood connections between celestial movements and earthly events that we had lost. Their wisdom about reading natural signs and predicting weather patterns has already saved several fishing fleets from storms that would have been disastrous." Old Bjorn, his remaining eye bright with the satisfaction of a navigator who had lived to see maps expanded beyond his wildest dreams, raised his ale horn in salute. "I've spent 40 years learning to read the signs of familiar waters. Now, in whatever time remains to me, I have the chance to help chart territories that will challenge everything we thought. We knew about the size and shape of the world, but it was Jarl Erik who spoke the words that captured the true significance of what they had accomplished. Rising from his carved chair with the dignity that had marked his leadership for decades, he addressed not just the people gathered in the hall, but the destiny they had discovered together. "When my daughter first showed us the map that would guide this expedition, we thought we were looking at a chance for survival. What we actually found was an opportunity for transformation, not just of our clan, but of our understanding of what is possible when people have the courage to trust in guidance that comes from unexpected sources." He gestured toward the artifacts and charts that covered the great table. "These treasures are valuable not because of their monetary worth, but because they represent proof that human achievement can exceed the boundaries we impose on ourselves. The ancient people who built those cities and created this knowledge were once as uncertain and limited as we considered ourselves to be. But they chose to push beyond those limitations, to explore and experiment and dream of possibilities that others thought impossible. Ingrid felt her mother's presence as strongly as if Sigrid were standing beside her in the crowded hall. The careful planning that had made this moment possible, the wisdom that had recognized the need to prepare for opportunities that might not arise for years, the trust placed in a daughter who would have to prove worthy of such extraordinary guidance, all of it had led to this evening when their small clan had become the center of discussions that would influence the future of northern exploration. As the formal presentations concluded and the evening settled into the comfortable rhythm of shared meals and storytelling, Ingrid found herself standing on the harbour dock where the modified ships rode at anchor under a canopy of unfamiliar stars. The navigation instruments they had recovered allowed them to identify constellations that had been invisible to previous generations, expanding their understanding of the night sky, just as the voyage had expanded their understanding of the world it covered. Leif joined her in the comfortable silence, both of them reflecting on the journey that had begun with spilled ale and accidental discovery, but had led to revelations that promised to echo through generations. "Do you think she knew?" he asked quietly. "Your mother. Do you think she understood how far beyond our original hopes this would lead?" Ingrid touched the amber necklace that had guided them to treasures beyond imagination. "I think she knew that the most important discoveries happen when we stop limiting ourselves to what we think is possible. The hidden map was just the beginning. The real journey was learning to trust that we were capable of achieving things that seemed impossible when we started." Above them, the stars that had guided explorers across unknown seas for countless generations continued their ancient dance, while below, the ships that would carry the next wave of discovery rested in waters that no longer seemed to mark the edge of the known world, but rather the beginning of adventures that stretched toward horizons they were only beginning to imagine.